Hello, welcome to the Pirate Preacher, where we explore the words of the first wave walker and battle life's storms. Arg! Ye ready for to sail with Jesus, mate? If so, climb aboard!
All right, we're diving into some pretty interesting stuff today. Blood Moon's biblical prophecy, and a sermon given to a congregation known as the crew of the Ship of Ghouls.
Wow.
Yeah, so this deep dive is going to take us into the world of a preacher who calls himself the Pirate Preacher. And in a 2025 sermon, he tries to make sense of some upcoming blood moons, and he does it through the lens of history and biblical prophecy.
Yeah, and what's interesting right off the bat is the preacher's way of connecting with his audience, like the whole pirate preacher persona, the maritime metaphors, calling his congregation the crew, calling where they are the Ship of Ghouls. It creates this really interesting dynamic.
Yeah, it's definitely not your average Sunday sermon, right?
Hey, right.
So he's talking about these blood moons that are happening in 2025, and he seems to be saying that they're not just random events in the sky, but they're actually like signs from God.
Exactly. He's arguing that God uses these events as warnings or signals, and he points to examples from the Bible like the plagues of Egypt or the Star of Bethlehem, even the darkness that happened during the crucifixion.
Okay, but here's where I get a little tripped up. He's also warning his congregation against trying to predict the exact date that Jesus is going to return. But then he spends a big chunk of the sermon suggesting that these 2025 blood moons could be tied to prophecies about the end times. Isn't that kind of contradictory?
It is, yeah. And that tension is actually pretty common in interpretations of prophecy. There's this desire to understand, when things are going to happen in the future, but also an acknowledgement that we as humans, we just don't know everything. It's like we're trying to read a map, but half the pages are ripped out.
Ah, okay, I see what you mean.
Yeah.
So what are the specific blood moon dates that he's talking about in this sermon?
Well, the first one he mentions is a total lunar eclipse that's happening on March 14th, 2025, and that date just so happens to be the Jewish holiday of Purim.
And for anyone who might not know, Purim commemorates the story of the Jewish people being saved from this plot to wipe them all out.
Right.
It sounds kind of ominous to have a blood moon happening on that specific day.
It does, and the preacher definitely picks up on that. He doesn't come right out and say it's like a prediction, but he definitely suggests that this blood moon happening on Purim could foreshadow some kind of danger or attack against Israel.
Interesting. What about the other blood moon dates?
Yeah, well, just a couple weeks later, on March 29th, there's a partial solar eclipse, and he points out that it falls really close to the anniversary of Operation Defensive Shield, which was a major military operation that Israel launched back in 2002 during the Second Intifada.
So he's drawing a parallel between these eclipses and possible conflict breaking out in Israel.
Yeah, it seems that way if you think about the broader story that he's telling. It's like he's suggesting that maybe there will be an escalation of conflict or that Israel's going to have to defend itself again.
Okay, I'm starting to see how he's connecting all these things together. What else does he mention in the sermon?
He also talks about a total lunar eclipse that's going to happen on September 7th, and that date happens to be the anniversary of when Jesus was rejected in Nazareth, which is where he first said that he was the Messiah.
Right. So what does he think about this eclipse happening on that anniversary?
Well, he seems to think that it could be a sign that a lot of people are going to reject Jesus and that this could lead to a period of spiritual darkness.
Wow, okay. And what about the last blood moon?
The last one he talks about is a partial solar eclipse that'll happen on September 21st, which is right at the end of the Jewish harvest season.
Man, all these eclipses happening on these important dates, it's pretty thought-provoking, even if you're not someone who really follows prophecy.
Absolutely. And what's really fascinating is how he connects these astronomical events to certain verses from the Bible that talk about the sun and moon going dark. It creates a really powerful image, a sense of anticipation, and maybe even a little bit of dread.
Yeah, I can see how that would resonate with his congregation. So is that all he has to say about the blood moons?
Not quite. He goes on to talk about something called the Jerusalem Law, which was passed back in 1980.
I'm not familiar with that. What is the Jerusalem Law?
Well, basically, it declared Jerusalem as the undivided capital of Israel. And he ties this law to the idea of something called Gentile times coming to an end, which is a major idea in some interpretations of end times prophecy within Christianity.
So if I'm following you, he's suggesting that this law, which reaffirmed Jewish control over Jerusalem, might be a sign that we're getting closer to these end times prophecies coming true.
That's how he's interpreting it through his own theological framework. It's really interesting how he's putting together these historical, political, and astronomical threads to make this really compelling story for the people listening to him.
It's definitely a lot to unpack.
Yeah, it really is a lot. And even though he spends a bunch of time building up this whole case for these blood moons being potential signs of things to come, he eventually kind of switches gears and starts telling his listeners that they should focus on being prepared and sharing their faith.
So it's not all doom and gloom.
Not at all, actually. The ending of the sermon is quite hopeful. He says that no matter when or even if these prophecies come to pass, the important thing is to focus on how we're living our lives right now. He even uses this cool nautical phrase he tells his crew to keep a weather eye out, but he means it in like a spiritual sense.
I like that.
Yeah, like be watchful and ready for anything that might come your way.
It's a good reminder that even with all this talk of prophecy and the end times, we still have choices.
Right.
We can choose how we react to these things and how we live.
Exactly. It's about being watchful, but not being scared, about living with purpose and focusing on sharing your faith with other people.
It's really interesting how he's able to combine all these different ideas like astronomy, history, biblical interpretation, and then weave them together into this story that's actually pretty captivating.
Yeah.
So what do you think are some key takeaways for someone listening to us right now, maybe someone who's hearing this sermon for the first time through our deep dive?
Well, one thing that stood out to me was how powerful storytelling is. Regardless of how you feel about the preacher's ideas, you can't deny that he's a good speaker.
Yeah.
He uses really strong images, historical references, verses from the Bible. He knows how to create a narrative that keeps people engaged.
He definitely knows how to get your attention.
And he also asks some big questions about how we look at events, things that happen in the sky or in history. Do we see patterns in meaning, or is it all just random? How do our beliefs shape how we see the world?
Right.
Those are questions people have been thinking about for a long time, and they're still relevant to us.
Definitely things worth thinking about. Are there any other takeaways that come to mind for you?
Yeah, another important point, I think, is that he emphasizes personal responsibility and taking action.
Yeah.
Even with all the talk about prophecy and the end of the world, the sermon ultimately tells people to live with faith, share that faith with others, and be a positive force in the world.
Yeah.
It's like a reminder that whatever might happen in the future, we have the power to choose how we live our lives today.
I like that. It's a message that anyone can connect with, no matter what they believe or how they interpret prophecy. And I think that's a great takeaway from this deep dive.
Yeah.
Whether you agree with the pirate preacher or not, he's made us curious about these events in the sky and what they could mean.
For sure. And I'd encourage everyone to keep an open mind, be critical of what you read and hear, and come to your own conclusions. As we've seen, these celestial events can be interpreted in many ways, and what we see in them often reflects our own beliefs and perspectives.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the world of blood moon's prophecy and the fascinating mix of astronomy, history, and faith. Until next time, keep looking up and keep exploring.
Thanks for sailing with the Pirate Preacher. May you enjoy fair winds and smooth swells on life's journey.